Hi, everyone. Welcome to our third session in this workshop on social, behavioral, economic, and governance aspects of pandemics. If you have questions for the panelists, you can post them in the live YouTube chat or tag us on Twitter at nsf_prepare. To learn more about Prepare, you can listen to our new podcast, Science Before the Storm, or visit our website at prepare-vo.org. Now I'll turn it over to Vivek Singh, who will moderate this session on misinformation. Vivek, please.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Vivek Singh from Rutgers University. It's my privilege and honor to welcome three distinguished panelists today. They are Professor Kathleen Carley from Carnegie Mellon, Professor Jennifer Golbeck from University of Maryland, and Professor David Lazer, who is from Northeastern University. We would have ample time for questions and answers. We'll do them together at the end of the talks from the three speakers. So first up, we have Professor Kathleen Carley from Carnegie Mellon. Kathleen is a professor in the School of Computer Science in the Institute for Software Research and the director of the Center for Computational Analysis of Social and Organizational Systems. Her research combines cognitive science, social networks, and computer science to address complex social and organizational problems. Over to you, Kathleen.
I think you have it on mute, Kathleen.
We see it.
All right, there we go. So, hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. I want to talk a little bit about the work that has been being done in my group, in our new Center for Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity, looking at misinformation with an air to what are some of the kind of big issues that we're seeing scientifically going on. Now, as we all know, as the pandemic hit, it has often been labeled a disinfodemic because of the huge quantity of disinformation and misinformation that has been being spread during the event. What we have found scientifically looking at this data is that, in fact, the nature and the storylines of disinformation has changed with the course of the virus. That is, early on, it was about the nature of virus. Then as people started, getting worried about it, you got false prevention stories, then you got fake government response stories. Then in the US, people started talking about reopen, and there was disinformation around that, then about the protests, and of course, there's stuff about the vaccines. Throughout all of that, there's been a number of conspiracy theories that actually predate the pandemic that have been added, new misinformation and disinformation have been added to those as you went through the different phases of the pandemic, both basically bringing in and utilizing people's confirmation bias against them, making them see all these new events as being absolutely related. We've also found that as people tried to stop this by banning various stories from one platform, it would simply go to another platform and then re-pop up on the original platform, either through the use of memes or through slight altercations in the storylines. The trouble with this area is, in fact, that it's not just about inaccurate facts. If it was just inaccurate facts, life would be easy, relatively. But in point of fact, there's many different kinds of things that are actually labeled and thought of as misinformation or disinformation, which range from things that it's not clear whether or not they are at all of that nature, to things that are easy to identify versus hard to identify. And by hard, I mean that even if we had perfect AI to help us with it, it would still be very difficult. What we found throughout all this is that inaccurate facts were not the majority of the disinformation claims that were going around that were a problem, that deepfakes were rare, but those that did exist, and I mean, there's thousands of them, but they're still relatively rare, were really targeted at women and sometimes at people of color. And we also find that the key problem is really the influence campaigns. The influence campaigns that operate at a social level designed to build groups that are then receptive to the kinds of information that is being spread that is not true. And when we look at how manipulation is conducted and how these influence campaigns are conducted, we find that the most successful of these are conducted on two levels. On one level, they're changing and altering and affecting what is being said. They're making certain narratives that are more easy to resonate, that have greater rhetorical reach, and so on. On the other hand, they're sending out messages in such a way and to people in such a way that they actually build and change the social networks underlying these, and who is therefore talking to whom about what. To do this, a number of tools are being used. These range from bots, which are completely automated accounts, which we have found, thousands and thousands of these in the discourse. Cyborgs, which are accounts that are sometimes a bot and sometimes a human being. They go back and forth, so they are sometimes hard to spot. Trolls, which are people who are actually usually operating under a pseudonym and are engaged in disruptive behavior, often which involves the use of abusive language and hate speech. Of course, there's the deep fakes. Memes are increasingly being used, particularly in any of the any countries that use the Romance languages. And the memes are actually being used to carry very subtly nuanced political discourse, which becomes an important way of also spreading the mis and disinformation. They're also using, of course, doctored images and videos. We already talked about deep fakes. One of the things that's very insidious and people often overlook is the use of the messages to include subconscious cues. These are tells in the message that give you some insight into the emotional state of the speaker, but more, they impact you, the reader. These are things like the use of certain colors and images, the use of cute kittens in images, the use of all capitals when you're writing your letter, and so on, that actually affect how the reader is perceiving the message and whether or not they will tend to retweet it, send it on, etc. But mostly what they're using is they're employing known biases that are in our brains against us. That is, they're employing your cognitive biases such as confirmation bias, flight or flight reflex, and so on against you. They're also employing people's tendency to think in terms, their social cognitive properties, such as their willingness to think about the generalized other and to build and to automatically go with the consensus that they think everyone else already shares. The tool, in order to analyze and study misinformation, we find that we need a whole lot of tools. And these tools employ network analysis, social network analysis, machine learning, and language technology. In my own group, we've invented all the tools you see on the right, from network analytic tools to machine learning tools that will match someone to say whether or not they look like a cyborg, to bot detection techniques, to new types of clustering for multi-level data, to stance detection, and so on. So we need all of these kinds of tools. And we have to employ them in an analytic pipeline. So the analytic pipeline, especially when you're dealing with millions of tweets, right? You have all these scripts that you want to collect your data and you deduplicate it. Then you run through computational linguistics to get out these cues that I talked about, to find the memes and so on. Then you run them through a bunch of machine learning tools to find the bots, to figure out what city or state things really are from, to determine whether something is a newspaper saying it or not, things like that. And then you run it through the network analysis. And then sometimes you take that back to the machine learning tools again for a deeper dive into certain kinds of behavior. So the technology and the methodology for looking at misinformation has radically advanced in the past couple of years. And this is an example of some of the kinds of things. Now, what we find in social media is that social media is not only all about networks, it's all about topic-oriented communities. And this means that a lot of our traditional measures, such as degree centrality in between us that we love and hold dear in social network analysis, had to be modified for the nature of social media. So we now talk about things like super spreaders, which on the one hand you say, oh, that's just degree centrality, but it's more than that because it's looking at your complete ability to affect to reach an audience across multiple platforms and so on. We can talk about super friends, which are individuals engaged in reciprocal relationships, again, across media, across platforms. But we found that the difference between these two is that while the super spreaders are the ones who are busy out there, when they say something, it gets into everybody's inboxes. The super friends are the ones that are actually building the connections, shaping the direction of the dialogue, and shifting people's points of view. And of course, then there's the echo chambers, which are these very dense communities, but they're dense not just on the one level, like I've shown here, which is who's talking to who, they're also dense in who is talking about what. In order to understand what is going on, of course, we need to move beyond this. So we developed what we call the BEND framework, looking at who is doing what to whom with what impact. By who, we're often talking about, is it a bot? Is it a troll? Is it a cyborg? Is it a super spreader? Is it a news agencies? Because that way we can begin to discriminate what kind of misinformation is being promoted because a celebrity likes it, because it came from a fake news site, or because it's just simply being sent by bots. We also look at who's impacting, like is it impacting individuals or communities? And we have new measures out now for being able to measure what is it doing, not just how many people is it reaching, but is it making the groups more echo chambery like? Is it increasing the level of polarization? Is it leading to mass hysteria? And it's only by looking at it within this kind of impact context that we can begin to get a full understanding of what the misinformation is actually doing to our communities. Within the middle of that, we look at the BEND maneuvers. The BEND maneuvers are something we've come up with. These are the maneuvers that are designed to shape content, such as engage, explain, and excite, and those that are designed to shape the community, such as backing an opinion leader or neutralizing them. Let's look at the narrative ones in a little bit more detail. The ones that are designed to shape narrative are things like engage, where you bring up discussions that are relevant to a topic, or explain, where you all see messages like this that go blah, 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 here's why. Or you can go get vaccinated, here's how. Okay, and explain messages are a very important way in which you actually spread and counter misinformation. The two that are that will resonate, I think, strongly with most people are the excite and dismay kind of maneuvers. Excite maneuvers are ones where you're spreading things that make people happy and excited and get them all jarred up emotionally so that they stop responding to things rationally and only emotionally, but from a happy viewpoint. You see a lot of this, for example, after every single soccer game or every single football game, if your team won. And dismay are discussions that are meant to bring about anger, worriedness, or sadness. And these kinds of arguments, these kind of posts on social media were used frequently in part to engender the protests that we saw happening, like the Reopen America campaigns. But all of these ones are designed to actually affect what is being talked about, how it is being talked about. They affect what we call the knowledge network, who is related to what. Here's a couple examples. You're seeing an excite one and a dismay one. The excite one, I can guarantee you, Ina Garten did not make a bleach cocktail. But they're basically, so this is a completely photoshopped image, and they're basically talking about what Trump supporters are doing. They're drinking cocktails, they're happy, etc., meant to increase excite. Messages like this associated with methane actually led to the deaths of a number of people. The dismay campaigns are ones like the one on the right, where they're talking about the World Health Organization admitting that asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19 is rare, blah, 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 and then saying everything about COVID-19 hysteria has been a lie. Statements like that are meant to get people angry and upset. And often they can be backed or enhanced by simply adding in a pointer to a website that contains more physical, more detailed information, as they often are. Here are examples of enhance and distort campaigns. The one is on the left tells us how to properly greet people, which is great. The one on the right, however, is telling us about distortion. They're distorting information. They're taking actual factual information. So hospitals get an extra $13,000 if they diagnose a death as COVID-19. And $39,000 if they use a ventilator. Now, they don't actually get it for that diagnosis per se. It's the reimbursement for the costs that were spent. So it's a distortion of the actual facts, but on the books, you could look at it this way. This one is hard to dispute. It's an example of hard to dispute. Here's an example of another enhanced one. This is actually, it was actually from Russia Insider. They're talking about Israel's Iron Dome air defense is a failure. Russian systems works. Here's why. On the surface, it looks like an enhance, but it's actually an enhanced campaign and explain and dismay. I point that out to simply show that many times social media posts can contain multiple types of maneuvers all at once, and that putting these together in complex ways is actually the way you actually conduct influence campaigns. But as I said, it's not all about talk, it's also about who's talking to whom. These are the maneuvers that we have been able to discover and that we now have measures for with respect to how you shape the community. You can back the opinion leader. Okay, this might be the governor, this might be just the local person who's a local pundit, or you can neutralize them. You can bridge individuals together to make a bridge two groups together, or you can make a group seem more narrow so that you don't have to pay attention to it. You can build groups where none existed, for example. All of these things are very easy to do. And it's important to recognize that doing this is central to influencing individuals because you're building the groups that they need to actually send them misinformation to. Here's an example. This is from the Euromaidan Revolution in the Crimea, the one on the left. And what you have is a group of young men who do not know each other, okay? All they do is they send out every now and then a message, you know, a light point image of women. The Euromaidan bot came in and started messaging in ways that caused Twitter to recommend each of these young men to the bot and to each other. And before long, all the young men were following each other and the bot. And at that point, the bot started telling them where to get guns and where to engage in the revolution. So you can actually build communities online, and bots very often used to do that. The one on the right is a denial of service attack effectively that was done by simply tweeting the numbers in Finnish, counting from 0 to infinity, left to right, up to down. And if you're trying to collect data on Finland at that point in time, 90% of what you would have collected if you're utilizing Twitter APIs would have simply been, you know, these numbers of words. So you would have effectively not known what was going on. Okay, this kind of geofencing is used in very targeted ways to keep those trying to overwatch the community from a resiliency perspective, from understanding what's going on. Here's examples of a bridge campaign. This is in the Reopen America, where they're actually building bridges between people who were out of work and people who were much more political and worrying about rights. On the right, you see a distortion campaign going on. Now, bots play a role in all this. What they're doing is there's many kinds of bots. We've identified at least 10 kinds. Two of the kinds that I want to point out right now are megaphone bots and broker bots, or amplifier. Megaphone or amplifiers and brokers. Megaphone bots surround a source, and whenever that source tweets certain kinds of messages, those bots simply take that message and resend it out. Now, this can be extremely helpful, you know, if you're, you know, sending out messages that a tsunami is coming and all these bots are retweeting it for you, okay? However, that's only one of the ways in which they've been used, and we'll see one that's less helpful in a moment. Broker bots are the ones that actually take communities and bridge them together. And we see a lot of instances of this being done in all the elections in the US and in Europe. And we're also seeing broker bots being used to build linkages between the anti-face mask group and the anti-vaccine group and the I need money because I'm out of work due to COVID group. And broker bots were very instrumental in the Reopen campaigns. In terms of the amplifier bots, what we find is that around state-sponsored media, and indeed also around sites that are known for spreading disinformation, the so-called fake news sites, there are little armies of bots around them, and they're busy amplifying and sending out their messages. In one of these around China, for example, was sending out any message that came out of China that was talking about why the US actually caused COVID-19, how we developed it in the lab at Fort Detrick. It got to there during a military exercise and was brought back to the States by the military. This one has now pervaded and just went crazy all over the world, basically saying the US was responsible for the disease. We also find that bots were more likely to be used during the pandemic to spread disinformation than to just spread general information. And of that disinformation, the disinformation they were most used for was the disinformation that was the most lethal or the most conspiracy-like. And so we find bots more used in the more extreme cases than they are just in general. Bots are not the spreaders of hate speech. What we find instead is that hate speech is coming from individuals, but bots are used to build hate communities. What you're seeing in the three big circles is the little red dots are actually actors that are using hate speech. The yellow ones are actors that are using abusive language, and the blue is everyone else. And going here from February to April, what's happening is that bots are being used to link the various people using hate speech together into these hate communities, and then to grow these hate communities. And then in April, they redirected those hate communities at new targets. Originally, they were targeted at the Chinese and at the cruise ships, and then they became retargeted, against, in April, against scientists and against certain governors. What a successful influence campaign therefore looks like is you have a group that is more or less connected on the social space. They're talking about more or less the same, you have a bunch of ideas that they're talking about that are more or less connected. And the members of that group are more or less talking about the same set of things. That's, kind of what a typical topic group looks like in social media. By the time they did these influence campaigns, they became highly connected in the social space. The ideas all got focused in on a particular idea, and all the individuals became focused in on that idea. So they were basically converting them into an echo chamber by increasing the density of connections on two levels at once. So a polarization campaign looks like what you're seeing here. What they're doing is you find an issue where you have a pro and anti side, then you add bots, trolls, cyborgs to both sides and boost them up. Building connections within, making the groups a little bit more echoey. Then you send an excite campaign on one side and a dismay campaign on the other. And sometimes you just wait for one of those to happen and then you just counter it. Then you back the opinion leaders or make the appearance of backing them, and you engage with people, getting one side happier and one side angrier. Now, why the emotion? The emotion is because when you get a group that is very tightly together, and you can get their emotions up, you topple them over into amygdala hijack. So they start responding to things emotionally rather than rationally. And you actually can do this as a group and do it faster, but they're only going to last in that heightened emotional state for a short time. So you want to do it right before you want some event to occur, such as a protest. Now, during the Reopen campaign, what did we find? We found that when you looked at accounts that were very likely to be considered bots, extremely likely to be considered bots, 30% of the accounts in the Reopen campaigns, not the Black America campaigns. Those look totally different. In the Reopen campaigns, 30% of the accounts appeared to be bots. And from those, 34% of the tweets, of all the tweets, came from bots. Moreover, at the same time, these bots and ones like them were used to create a surge of attacks on science, particularly the medical experts. Moreover, we found that some of the Reopen America tweets referred to conspiracy theories, such as that COVID-19 was a hoax, that the hospitals were actually empty, that coronavirus itself was a lie, and it was caused by 5G, and that the hospitals were moving mannequins around, not people, as a COVID cover-up, and so on. So many of these messages are also anti-vax and anti-face mask. And disinformation and misinformation were used to distort, to also at the same time, distort people's understanding of the Constitution. Now, if we look at it empirically, what we see is that over time, from February going out to June, there's a number of new counts that are created. And these new counts, some of them start spewing tweets on the pro-reopen side, that's the blue, and some of them start on the anti-reopen side, which is the red. So they're entering both sides of it. Not all of the new accounts are bots. Some of them are trolls. Some are just random people, But these new accounts lead to a surge of new activity that respond to key events. So when they announce Operation Gridlock in Michigan, you get a spur of things. Okay, when real Donald Trump tweets out the liberate, Michigan, liberate Minnesota tweet, you get a surge of response. So they always react in response to things, but then they lead to a long-term cause. The reopened ones are all very tightly connected. They're very coordinated. They're very organized. You have way less, fewer numbers, but also less coordination on the anti-reopen side. And they're coordinated for different purposes. On the pro-reopen side, they are coordinated in the messages they send out. They send out messages about reading the Gateway Pundit and Breitbart and Facebook. They send out messages that are pro-MAGA and pro-QAnon. They send out messages about how everyone's dying, no one's dying from COVID, but everyone's out of work. Okay, on the people who are against reopening side, the bots and so on, the whole group as a whole is much more decentralized. It's much less focused, but it's more trying to reach to the other side saying, hey, things are, just stay with it a little bit longer. Things will be fine. There's more verified accounts acting and so on. And basically they respond by being reactive to the pro-reopen side. The bots, and here your bots are coordinated, not in terms of setting the same message, but they're coordinated in terms of sending confusion. The bots all start sending out completely different kinds of things, leading the group in all these different ways, and thereby sowing confusion in the whole anti-reopen side of the thing. We've seen this exact same pattern on climate change is a fraud, that would be the reopen side, and climate change is real side. The exact same thing in many other cases where you get polarized behavior. As we got closer and closer, went through each of the protests one by one, from Michigan to Virginia to Pennsylvania. By the time you got to Pennsylvania, this behavior pattern was perfected. They were able to create an echo chamber around Governor Wolf of about 0.99, which is incredibly high. It only goes from 0 to 1. And all the red dots you're seeing in this picture are actually bots, right? And what these bots are doing is they're engaging in these backing and building and excite maneuvers. What are they backing and building? Well, they're backing and building a group that is saying, let's reopen. And they're building excitement about the reopen campaign. And when they're doing that, what they're doing is they start with individuals who have a legitimate concern, like, I need money, I'm out of work, right? Lockdown's hurting me, to these building and bridging campaigns where they're linking these people to questions about fear, to questions about freedom, okay? And leading to a rhetorical shift in the end to a discussion about rights, okay? And you can look at this, and it was almost like this was a pretest for the attack on the Capitol. So in social cybersecurity, which is what this is under, what we're trying to do is understand and make sense of the social media environment, the online environment, both in terms of the science and the engineering. There's lots of open things left out there to figure out. Clearly there's not, but I want to point out that in the last 2 years, since people have started working in this, really focusing in this area, the number of people working in the area has grown to the tens of thousands worldwide, and probably even larger, with now there's half a dozen conferences in the area and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for that amazing introduction, all the ideas that you shared. A quick reminder for everyone, you can ask questions in the live chat on YouTube, or you can tweet with using the name @NSF_prepare, and we'll be taking all the questions at the end of the 3 speakers. So next up, we have Professor Jennifer Golbeck. Professor Golbeck, she is a professor in the School of in the School of Information at the University of Maryland. Her research focuses on artificial intelligence and social media, privacy, malicious online behavior, and trust on the web. So please take it away, Professor Golbeck.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to present a lot of other people's work and questions that I think that's motivating. I have really been playing in the space of kind of all the bad things that people do online for a while, and that's kind of coalesced for me into this new research space that has just come with a bunch of really interesting studies that other people have been producing over the last year. I'm glad that they have been more productive than I was able to be during the pandemic. And so I want to kind of cover all of those and use that as a way to lead into what I think are some really interesting research questions coming out of what we've seen. So let's take a look at kind of mis and disinformation. And I'm really interested in kind of the motivations that people have for sharing it, how they believe it, how we can intervene, and really what interventions aren't effective, and how that leads to some interesting questions from a computational perspective. So the first is a study that I think is still in preprint stage, but basically looking at how do people believe in disinformation and conspiracy theories. And a lot of this is going to be related to COVID-19, though I think as we'll see throughout these studies as they come forward, a lot of this applies kind of generally. So the first is that we've seen a lot of the focus on conspiracy theories, disinformation on social media, focus on that which is coming out of the right-wing side, because obviously Trump was pushing that a lot during his presidency, especially during COVID and the election. And of course, it had the most dramatic impacts in the insurrection on the political side. So we've really been focused on right-wing conspiracy theories and disinformation. But I think this study is a good reminder of results that there's a lot of evidence for, which is it's not really a right wing or a Republican problem. Republicans and Democrats tend to share fake political news and believe fake news that talks badly about the other side at about the same rates. Their willingness to share that on social media is about the same. We do see that, at least from this study, that Republicans are slightly more likely to want to share fake news that's not about politics. I think we still need some more research if that's going to be true, but because our focus is kind of on political issues in terms of the real world impacts of mis and disinformation, I think that this is just a nice study to start with, that we absolutely can see this from both sides. And since we've been focused on it as something coming primarily out of the right wing in terms of the real world impacts in the last year to year and a half, that is not really a problem just coming from that side. But the thing that I think had really the strongest impact on me, and that I think is an opportunity to think more carefully about these problems or think about them in a different way, is this really beautiful piece of work that shows that people with higher collective narcissism share more misinformation. So I like to look a lot at the connection between psychology and online behavior. And for me, a lot of that tends to be using artificial intelligence to identify or estimate those psychological traits in people. I've looked at individual narcissism, which is something that we're more kind of colloquially familiar with when we talk about narcissism. Like, I think I'm better than everybody. Maybe people don't recognize how awesome I am, and I get really frustrated about that. That would be individual narcissism. But collective narcissism is basically the belief that your group, which we would call your in-group in psychological terms, is exceptional. It's better than everybody else, and that you don't really get the credit that you deserve. So this is certainly something that probably feels very familiar if you're talking about US politics, that you hear, oh, we are the real Americans, and whatever the group is, whether it's a political party, a political leaning, or say a profession that you work in, we don't get enough respect. People don't treat us the way that we deserve to be treated. So basically my group is not only really amazing, but also better than everybody else, right? So we're dismissive of the external group, and that people don't appreciate how great we are. That's what collective narcissism is. What we tend to see with collective narcissism is that if your group is attacked, so if we watch this play out with COVID, so you could say Trump supporters could have high collective narcissism, and they may not necessarily call themselves that. They could say conservatives, they could say real Americans, but essentially people with those right-wing leanings who are followers of Trump, not only do they believe that they're kind of superior to everyone else, but they are hypersensitive. Anyone with collective narcissism is hypersensitive to attacks on their group. So if you say something that's even kind of neutral but not positive, they may see that as an attack and then really come after people from the out group who are attacking them. They also kind of see the out group in moral terms, negative moral terms. So I can be like, oh, I'm a professor and I think professors are great and I'm really proud to be that. But I don't see people who aren't professors as evil. Collective narcissism would say that you see the out group, the people who oppose your group, as kind of bad and evil and unworthy. And so that manifests in a lot of ways. I've got a couple slides to talk about some studies on this. And one of them is that people who have higher collective narcissism tend to share more misinformation in conspiracy theories. This study particularly focused on COVID-19, though there's a lot of research on that, and it tends to be true in general. And the reason for that kind of comes down to, if you see yourself as part of the true Americans, right? That I am a patriot, I support President Trump, and then this pandemic shows up and Trump says it's going to go away, that we have it under control, that everything is going to be fine, that it's somebody else's fault. And then it keeps spreading. That really threatens your identity as being part of a group that's really superior, because if you were really that great, then you'd be able to control this. So the fact that something is basically countering this vision that you have of your narrative, this narrative that you have of your group is kind of superior and better and able to control everything, that's threatened by, say, the pandemic. And so then there has to be some reason that your group, which is so amazing, isn't able to control that. It must be a conspiracy perpetrated by others, whether that's another country, whether that's the medical establishment. And Kathleen covered a lot of those theories in her talk. It's a way to counter the narrative that, oh, my group has failed at this, so maybe we're not as really outstanding and amazing as I thought. So that then plays into the willingness to share conspiracy theories on social media. We also know kind of generally that collective narcissism is connected to conspiracy theory beliefs. So this is just another really nice study that recently came out looking at climate change, that people who have high national collective narcissism, so I believe my country is really outstanding, we're superior, we're better than every other country. The more you believe that, so the higher your collective narcissism is with respect to nationalism, the more likely you are to believe climate change conspiracy theories. And it plays out in an interesting way where there you're actually then less likely to take steps that would make your country better off. So we see this a lot, that collective narcissism makes people believe conspiracy theories generally more often, and then also prompts them to share those more often. And this is really the heart of where I think there's a lot of really interesting computational work to do, which I'm going to talk about later. Okay, so from these studies, we know that it kind of doesn't matter which side you're on. Republicans and Democrats likely to believe disinformation, likely to share disinformation. And then people who have this higher sense of collective narcissism are also more likely to buy into conspiracy theories and share those as well. So great, that gets us some psychological insight into who's doing this and why they might be doing it. And then the question comes, well, what do we do about it? Are there interventions that we can use that might be effective here? There's some conventional wisdom about some ways that we might address that, and the conventional wisdom tends to be wrong. A lot of studies are showing. So a couple slides here on really beautiful work that's been done recently on interventions. This is a paper that just came out in CHI this year. I love it so much, on correcting misinformation. So this study basically looked at, I think 2,000 people on Twitter who had shared fake news, basically some sort of mis or disinformation, and they would respond with a link to a fact check website as an intervention, and then follow what impact that intervention had going forward. And what they found is that it really backfired, that essentially people who were corrected with a fact-checking website when they shared misinformation went on to share even more extreme partisan content going forward, and kind of the overall quality of the information that they shared after that correction went down. So by intervening, by sharing a fact-checking link in response to something, it essentially kind of made them angry that they went out, they shared more stuff that was more toxic. They generally shared poorer quality stuff. This is, on one hand, unexpected, because you might think that, hey, a nice correction, especially if it's, you know, not full of vitriol, but if you just go, hey, like, here's a fact check to counter that, that may be effective with some people. But we've seen from a lot of studies that look at these kinds of interventions that we have this backfire effect. If you put that in the context of collective narcissism, it actually makes perfect sense. One of the defining characteristics of collective narcissism, like I said before, is this really extreme reaction to perceived criticism of your in-group. And so if you see yourself as a member of a group and someone has corrected you, that comes as basically an attack on your group, and it prompts a really outsized reaction that often will lead to a further embracing of your group, like buckling down, you know, digging further in. And so that could mean going to the more extremes of that group, sharing that more extreme information, and really reacting harshly against that. So this study is, like I said, a really beautiful piece of work, and then putting that observed impact in the context of collective narcissism, I think kind of explains some of that behavior. Another really nice piece of work is that is kind of speaking to this common wisdom that the echo chamber is part of the problem, right? Because we're surrounded by people on social media who share our views, that might actually make us more extreme. It may make us see more fake news that's not countered. And so if we just expose people to views from both sides, then that might actually cut down on the sharing of fake news and misinformation. It may moderate people's views a bit. That also turns out not to be true. This is one study. There's also a really nice book that came out that I just did a review of for Science Magazine called Breaking the Social Media Prism, that also looks at a lot of this, both understanding how people respond to different kinds of interventions and which ones might work. In this case, what we see is that exposing people to opposing views can actually increase polarization. One of the really nice studies in that book, Breaking the Social Media Prism, looked at if we have people and we take them from across the political spectrum, we expose them to views from the other side. We do that for a month, then see what happens. And these aren't just people on the extremes. So in the book, they do talk about one person who's a pretty kind of vocal Trump supporter who goes online, posts a lot of pro-Trump stuff, kind of harasses other people with that. And also someone who's a kind of moderate liberal, doesn't really buy into all of the Democratic Party platforms, so wouldn't be considered a partisan, but considers themselves to be sort of on the liberal side. They expose them to social media, they're essentially sharing news and information and views from the other side for a month and then see what happens. And what they found is that on both sides, people became more polarized in their views. So they moved, the person who was a Trump supporter moved further to the right. The person who was a kind of moderate liberal moved further to the left, started identifying herself more with Democratic core principles, even though she didn't consider herself much of a partisan at the beginning, actually became more polarized and more connected to that group after a month of being exposed to what we saw, what the other side was posting. So essentially, the idea of breaking that echo chamber is not an effective way to reduce polarization, that it actually increases people's polarization as they're exposed to more on the other side. So the question kind of comes down to, like, what kind of intervention can you do? And this drives the research questions that I personally think are really interesting. These are things that I plan on working on, but obviously there is a ton of really brilliant work coming out of really the pandemic and the 2020 election, looking at all sorts of tests of interventions and things. So this is kind of one peek at what I think is really interesting. But I hope looking at these studies, which have really been inspiring to me, can reveal that there's a lot of interesting questions there. So this idea of collective narcissism is one that really struck me. There's some good work coming out on that, but it's something that in the psychology space, it's been looked at for quite a while. And so, I have this question of, can we automatically identify people with high collective narcissism? And kind of in parallel that, can we automatically identify people susceptible to conspiracy theory beliefs? So a lot of the work that I've done in my lab has been, as I mentioned earlier, psychologically profiling people by using their social media data and building machine learning algorithms that essentially take whatever features we can engineer from that data and use it to predict individual traits. So we did that probably 10 years ago on Big 5 personality traits, which was pretty successful. We've done it on individual narcissism. So we've built models that take the text and your interaction patterns on social media and can predict your individual narcissism. So do I think I'm better than everybody else? That I deserve special recognition, that people don't really understand how awesome I am? That is something that we have models that can work on. So then there's a question of, can we identify people with high collective narcissism? We have one of those studies underway now. There's very short survey instruments to measure people's collective narcissism, 3-question, 5-question surveys. So we essentially have people online taking those, giving us access to their social media data. And hopefully, a study that we'll have coming out in the next 6 months is going to show us a model that will be able to accurately predict that. Kind of in parallel, I'm really interested in identifying people susceptible to conspiracy theory beliefs. I think there's going to be an overlap there. The research is pretty clear from what I've been reading that people with high collective narcissism are very prone to believing conspiracy theories in general. Now, that's a correlation. I don't know how well it works in the flip. So if you believe in conspiracy theories, do you necessarily have high collective narcissism? So it's unclear that those two are going to be kind of the same models, but identifying people susceptible to conspiracy theory beliefs, I think, is really interesting. Fortunately for that, we don't even need to collect a lot of data from people that they would volunteer to us. We have tons of that data available. All of these data sets of social media posts, hashtags related to both election fraud, the insurrection, and COVID-19 give us people who have been sharing conspiracy theory related information on social media. And so we've got data already out there that tells us here are the people who have believed in those. And I'm interested in, can we build models to look at their social media behavior independent of those things that are clear telegraphs of conspiracy theories, and just tell psychologically, I basically classify people as susceptible to those beliefs. Assuming that works, that we can do hopefully both of those things, but even just one of them, there's a few questions that come up. Certainly in terms of practice, what interventions could be useful with these individuals? So I shared a couple studies here that showed interventions that didn't work. And especially if we're considering people who have high collective narcissism, it kind of makes sense that those interventions didn't work because of the way they were approached. So if we can identify people who are susceptible to conspiracy theories, who have high collective narcissism, are there things that we can leverage from the psychological literature that might suggest here are effective interventions? And then could we translate to something that works at scale, that's not going to offend that in-group mentality? And that may mean things about where the message is coming from or how it's telegraphed. And then could that actually be effective? There's some evidence that this is possible. So I don't have additional references in here to other people's work, but we've seen interventions like that play out in terms of hate speech. So there's a really brilliant study. We can talk about it in the comments. I'll pull the reference up for people who want it, that looks at people who are using the N-word in their tweets. The intervention was essentially to have a bot that looked like a person automatically respond with text that was basically like, hey man, there are real people who are hurt when you use language like that. And that was the response. And then track what happened after that intervention. What the researchers found in that case is that that intervention had no impact unless the bot that tweeted it looked like it was coming from a white man. And if the bot looked like a white man who tweeted the exact same text as everybody else, it decreased the use of hate speech going forward for a long time in those accounts. So it was an effective intervention, essentially because it's coming from a member of the in-group. It looks like it's coming from a white man. These are white men who were tweeting the racial slurs in the first place. And an intervention that was like not especially harsh, but it came from a member of the in-group, then had a positive effect on reducing hate speech going forward. So that's just a hint that there may be effective interventions that respect the collective narcissistic traits of people that would allow us to reduce the conspiracy theories and disinformation that they tweet going forward. So if we can identify those people, if we can say, hey, this is a person with those traits, that may lead us to the design of more effective interventions. And that kind of goes along with, can these interventions automatically be targeted? Another piece of work here that I don't have outlined in the questions, but I think is worth looking at is, can we actually track people developing these sorts of characteristics, these sorts of information patterns? So, the question for me is if we can actually get data to do this. But what I would love to see is, say, accounts that are kind of tweeting about sports and boxing and cars, and then all of a sudden start tweeting about political misinformation, COVID-19 misinformation, racist misinformation, or hate speech. I've found a couple of these accounts sort of by accident. It's in my brain to start looking for them. I don't know how we could find that on scale, but I'm really interested essentially in the radicalization process, which Kathleen kind of touched on a few things relevant to this, but how do we get people to shift into buying into that kind of group identity that may make them more likely to start taking these actions? And are there interventions that we can find to stop that? There's new work coming out that says there is some intervention that can be successful there. There's an approach that is used in other fields outside of computing called inoculation, where essentially you're vaccinating people against misinformation. You train them to recognize what it looks like when you see something that's a really hard to debunk way of sharing information. Again, going back to what Kathleen talked about, you say, so here's the kind of thing that they're going to say to you. Doesn't that seem like a thing that's hard to argue against? And they go, yeah. And you go, well, actually, here's the flaws in that argument. Here's how you could argue against that, so you don't get tricked by these people. And that kind of inoculation, you give people a few examples like that so they learn to recognize this when it's coming up, actually is really effective in making people less likely to believe that kind of misinformation or conspiracy theory when they see it later. And it makes them more likely to speak up and debunk it. So that's sort of parallel to this, but I think it's suggestive of the fact that there are these kinds of interventions that if you can target them at the right time might be effective. I think that's a bigger project that really requires a longitudinal ability to identify people who have been kind of won over into these conspiracy groups and then think about it. So it's a slightly more difficult piece of work, but I think something really motivated by the times that we're in, and it would be great if we're able to do that. So with that, I will save the rest of time for questions, which I know we'll do later. But if you want to talk to me, these are good ways to get in touch. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that amazing talk. Next up, our final panelist is Professor David Lazer. David is a university distinguished professor of political science and computer sciences at Northeastern University. He's also the co-director of the NU Lab for Texts, Maps, and Networks. His research is focused on misinformation and computational social science. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Vivek, and a pleasure to share the stage with Kathleen and Jennifer, truly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a project. If you go to covidstates.org, you can see a lot of what we've done, a chunk of which is about misinformation and things like trust. We have a trust tracker there, and I think that's actually a lot of what misinformation is really about. And then I'm going to conclude with sort of some bigger picture lessons about thinking about studying the information ecosystem, as well as what investments, and since this is a panel discussion around NSF, thinking about what should be national investments in these spaces. So Let me see, is this moving forward? There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the team, and I'm going to focus a little bit on vaccines related stuff because obviously that's pretty relevant to the moment, and talk about vaccine misinformation and online misinformation, and then I'll discuss, as I said, conclude with lessons for NSF. Project overview. This has been a massive, complex project. I have to say this has been unlike any research experience I've had. The genesis of this came from talking to a colleague of mine, Alex Vespignani, who in March 2020, asking how serious this was going to be, and he did a remarkably good job of charting out the next year. And I decided that I would really shift all of my efforts to studying what was going to unfold, because obviously this has been a historic and difficult moment. This has been a big team project with folks been doing, so we've been trying to cover every state, 50 states plus DC, and getting enough responses in every state, so that we could make statistically useful statements about every state. So this is around 20 to 25,000 responses per roughly every month. It's not, sometimes we've done it a little more often, sometimes a little less often for various reasons. It's also involved social media data collection, and also for some people a browser add-on so that we could track what they were doing online, what websites they were going to, and the like. I'm not going to get too much into that right today because time is short. Again, let me acknowledge the large team of folks from Northeastern, Harvard, Northwestern, and Rutgers. This was initially something that Katya Agnyanova and Matt Baum and I pushed forward, and we've brought in a variety of amazing people. So this is all very much a team effort. So I'm going to talk a little bit about vaccines, and really this is sort of setting up some of the points around misinformation. I think the societal effects of under-vaccination will be pretty serious, and I think that we'll see, in the late fall some significant outbreaks, in part because of segments of our population that are under-vaccinated, and part of that has to do with misinformation, or I'll put more generally a lack of trust in the system. I'm going to give a sense of what we can do with what we've collected. So, for example, we can zoom in over time on who have been vaccine enthusiasts. So we see, for example, older Americans, Asian Americans, people with graduate degrees, all have been consistently enthusiastic about vaccines from the very beginning. And we could also look at what groups have been, more vaccine resistant, Republicans, less educated, African Americans. We see were for much of this period the most vaccine resistant, and then actually dropped precipitously between December 2020 and February 2021 for reasons you might guess, in terms of political changes in the U.S. So, here's, we could look at who's vaccine resistance. We can see, especially, for example, the high role. I mean, there's a big age gradient, and but there are also huge partisan elements. And what's interesting here is that if we throw trust into the regression, because we have a trust scale based on trust in various institutions, that pretty much swamps everything else. It's not to say that everything else disappears, but it's much more important than everything else, and that it pretty much is the process by which partisanship and ideology is affecting vaccine resistance. That is, there is a lack of trust in the in the institutions, both the political and scientific institutions, and that distrust is substantially concentrated on the right end of the spectrum, and to a lesser extent among independents. And because of the scale of the survey, I should note we can zoom in on particular demographics, very focused demographics that are vaccine skeptical. And part of the point here is that these are issues that are macro patterns, but they're also issues of particular niches. So, for example, we can see especially that younger mothers, for example, tend to be more vaccine resistant. So here we're looking at younger women, parents versus non-parents. We see a big difference for women who are parents versus non-parents. That's not the case for men, and it's much higher for younger women. That difference is much larger for younger women than older women. And some of that, again, may have to do with misinformation regarding impacts, potential impacts of the vaccine on fertility. But we also see that resistance, and this will be consequential come the fall, with respect to vaccination of oneself, but also vaccination of children. And so that we can imagine that this will emerge in the fall as schools are, as K through 12 schools are opening up as a potential issue. We can also zoom in because of the scale of the survey, because we aim for state level data. We can see, right down to the state level. So we can see special centers geographically in the Deep South, and as well sort of the Upper Rockies as being sort of centers of particular vaccine resistance. New England, I'll note, in the Northeast is relatively low levels of vaccine resistance. I think Massachusetts, for example, where I live, is I think the least vaccine resistant state. So let's shift now to talk about vaccine misinformation. And I'm not saying exactly that misinformation is the cause of all these issues, but it is likely the cause of some of the issues that we see with vaccine resistance. And I want to talk both about who is misinformed, who is consuming misinformation, and who is sharing misinformation. So I'll just give you some examples of questions we had regarding vaccine misperception. So these are misbeliefs, and so we can look at particular sets of misbeliefs as well as who holds those misbeliefs, and these are just some examples of inaccurate statements as well as accurate statements, and what the rates of a belief that these are accurate or inaccurate statements. And we can, see, for example, somewhat higher levels of belief among African Americans than other demographics. And when we look at age, and we see sort of this very interesting, this is something that's come up again in our data, sort of an inverse U relationship, where the most skepticism of around vaccines is among the sort of the 25 to 44-year-old cohort, and a lot of that I think is driven by, in particular, younger mothers, as I discussed earlier, and so, part of what I'm trying to do here is like, let's try to get into people's heads. And then the other element is looking at the information ecosystem, which is presenting information before people that might be, supporting these beliefs and misbeliefs. So to do this, I'm building on some work we had a couple of years ago on looking at fake news on Twitter during the 2016 election. This involved using matched data between Twitter handles and voter data. So we were pretty sure that these are real people's behaviors, and which is useful. I think bots are super important, but also then we ultimately care about bots in as much as it enters the behaviors and what people see, what real people see. And so that's the sort of particular focus here. What we're doing is trying to look at the behaviors and exposure levels of quote unquote real people with known demographics. And so this allows us to do things like look at what's the market share of vaccine misinformation. So we're working with a list of regular sources of vaccine misinformation. And so we can see, for example, the biggest website that we see being shared on Twitter with vaccine misinformation in the US is the Children's Health Defense.org, which is the website of RFK Jr. That has, a long tradition in anti-vaccine activism. And we can zoom in on particular URLs and how much those URLs were being shared. So it turns out if you look at the top of that list, the top URL being shared from the Children's Health Defense website was around Hank Aaron dying shortly after, 18 days after receiving the Moderna vaccine. Again, this is an interesting thing, and this gets to sort of part of what also Kathleen was talking about, the different roles of manipulation of the information ecosystem. This is not so much wrong as misleading, because there was no evidence linking his death to receipt of the vaccine. But you can see how that this affects the potentially prominently affects the narrative around the risks of the vaccine. We can also then see how concentrated sharing vaccine misinformation is. So we developed a classifier that identified vaccine-related information. We looked at misinformation websites, and we had a matched sample of 1.5 million people we've been tracking, and 100% of the vaccine tweets came from 2,300 accounts, so 0.15% of accounts, and around half of that came from 150 accounts, so 0.01% of accounts. And most of this, and again, we can zoom out on the demographics of sharing. Most of this is coming from white Republicans, age 50 plus, and especially women. So the processes of sharing and provision of misinformation and getting some sort of very basic descriptives of the amounts and where it's coming from. And this is another analysis we did, which was looking at fake news, COVID-19 related fake news, and we can again break it down by partisanship and age. And this is something that's come up repeatedly in the literature, that a vastly disproportionate share of misinformation is coming from the right. Although here we also see a lot from independents, and that there's a remarkable age gradient as well. So it's not coming, it's not largely coming from, say, younger people on the right, but it's coming, tenfold more, say, from people older 65 than, let's say, people who are 30 to 50. So we can see this remarkable age gradient and partisan gradient. Interestingly, though, when we look at misbeliefs, these relationships are rather different. So there are two things. There's still a partisan element, but it's very mild, right? Like there's a bit higher level of misbeliefs on the right than on the left, but it's actually nothing to write home about. And with age, there's actually the opposite gradient, that younger people are more likely to hold misbeliefs than older. So again, we have to be very careful about what we see being shared, say on Twitter, which is being done by a very tiny activist elite, like 1 out of 1,000, versus the median person and what they believe, because we see, again, age flips in terms of its relationship, and partisanship doesn't exactly disappear, but it's rather than dealing with differences of 10 to 1 or 50 to 1 in terms of behavioral differences. We're dealing with differences rates of accuracy of like 10% or 20%. So those are, you know, radically different. Also, just briefly note we've been looking at the impact of January 6th on misinformation sharing on Twitter, and we do see evidence that of a substantial drop in COVID-related misinformation after January 6th because I think because of the deplatforming of many of the sharers of political misinformation, who are also sharing COVID-related misinformation. And here's the same for vaccines. So we'd estimate maybe it's on the order of a 50% drop for COVID-19 and a 1/3 drop in terms of vaccination. And you know, this still fits if we extend further on either side of the timeline. I'll note we have a website up, so COVID States will point you to this, but we have a website up. I actually have to make it fully up to date, but it goes through the spring, which shows you the most shared tweets and allows you to zoom in on particular states and both nationally, particular states, and dig down into different demographics. So, you know, that it's a particular kind of fun, I suppose, if you're into this, but like it gives you a sense, and you know, the data in terms of what's being shared is downloadable, and we can also look at what are the top URLs being shared, and we can also look at the frequency of particular distinctive fake news keywords that we've identified, and you know, it gives you a sense of what are the sort of narratives that are floating around now around, you know, often around particular, you know, particular keywords that are associated with those words. And some of these, yeah, it's useful when you search them, you can quickly identify where those dark corners of the internet are. Also note, this allows you to zoom in on different platforms, like Twitter allows you can see what content from other platforms are being shared. So for example, here are the top 12 videos on vaccines on YouTube. I guess we're being broadcast on YouTube right now. So some irony there, but we can see where the top videos are and look at the partisanship of, you know, for example, of the demographic patterns of who's sharing which of these, and so, for example, the one of these that was removed by YouTube that's the most shared among Republicans is this video by Simone Gold on the truth about COVID-19, and it's sort of a greatest hits of misinformation regarding vaccines. I mean, these are just the top 3 here of, you know, that it will make COVID-19 worse in patients, and it's being targeted at minorities, and that may cause fertility problems. Like it was really impressive of all the boxes of misinformation this one video checked. Ironically, it was taken down by YouTube, but we found it because it was reposted on YouTube, so it was back up on YouTube. So we can again get a sense of, you know, like what are the demographics of who shared this. So again, we see it disproportionately white, Republican, female, and older. So again, that fits with some of our other stories here. But again, part of it is to get a sense of what can be done with this method, set of methods. The other thing we've done is auditing what Google search shows and how often Google search points to misinformation. So what we've done, we've been doing 35,000 queries per day on Google, and doing some of the, you know, same queries around the country to see how it might be contextualized in different states. And then what we do is we put in these initial queries, but then we look at what Google proposes as autocomplete. And this gives you a sense of the autocomplete network. So you start out with a root query, and then you just You just see what it suggests day after day, place after place. So we've done at this point, actually now it's probably more like 150 million search results. And so we can say what Google tends to point to and what queries yield misinformation domains. So for example, it turns out that for a period there, that putting the queries that included the words ingredient and vaccine were much more likely to point to misinformation domains, and there was over a particular period of time here we're looking at, are those terms in the query, and so there was this period in late 2020 where we could identify where Google was suddenly pointing to a lot more misinformation domains, and arguably that's part of like this notion of the data void that some have written about, like from Data and Society, and so you could see the set of news stories that emerged and that were pointed to by Google over this distinct period of time, and then they sort of dropped off the radar screen. Why that's happening, I don't know. But again, I think it points to one of the things we need to do is understand the algorithms underlying the internet. So there's no grand conclusion here. I do have some lessons drawn there. These are some of the resources we've issued. Our focus primarily has actually been to affect public discourse, to inject high quality information into the public conversation during these times. So we've issued 50 something reports. We've been, fortunate enough to get a lot of visibility and, from the New York Times to NPR, to wherever, but I think we've at least had some modest success. I want to, by the way, thank the NSF for their support, because part of this was catalyzed by two related rapid grants in the spring of 2020, and none of this represents their viewpoint. The standard disclaimers. This does not represent NSF views, but I do appreciate the rapid, literally and rapid turnaround by NSF on this. And there are a lot of additional projects, and like I said, we've issued 50 something public reports that are posted on the website. I do want to take a moment to think about the broader lessons here as I've reflected on what is easy and hard to do and where there's a need to make investments. I think it's easy, and I'll put quotes around here because it's really not easy. It's actually very hard, but it's doable. I mean, like, it's easy after you put literally years of high quality labor into something, then actually some of the marginal things become a lot easier. So like our development of that matched Twitter voter data was a bear. But once we have that resources, there are a lot of things that we can do on the margin that are actually pretty light lifting. But what we're doing there is we're looking at the mechanisms of sharing and dissemination. We're looking at on Twitter. It's a lot harder to look at sharing and dissemination on other platforms like Facebook, right? Because they're walled gardens. You don't have the access to the relevant information. And then furthermore, it's harder still to study attention because that requires, Twitter does not have available through its API what people see. It only has what people do, that is what they've posted and what they're sharing, but it's not showing you what people see. And ultimately, a lot of what we care about is what people see, what they attend to, and then of course, ultimately, and this is the hardest, is to link attention to offline behaviors and attitudes. And it's not that these are impossible to do, but they're really hard, and they require having instrumentation, research instrumentation, that's not directly available from the platforms. And this is partly why we had that, like, this monitoring component as part of our project. It was a modest part of our project because that would have required actually a lot more funds than we could get through a rapid grant. So we sort of had a pilot with, on the order of 600 or 700 people, something you could do something with. And we did this, a version of this in 2018. Here's an example where we had this instrumentation where we could see what people browse and link it to their trust. And it turns out that being exposed to fake news in 2018 was looking at repeat responses was linked to lowering your trust in the media and increasing your trust in government when, but that's in part reflecting the fact that a lot of the fake news was supportive of the government and trying to undermine the mainstream media. But I think that we really need to invest in a shared research platform that has the following features. The first, that it's large scale because a lot of behaviors are niche. That looks at intra-platform behaviors because so much of what happens is within platforms. That incorporates audits of platform algorithms because they're so important, and they're, it's both interesting scientifically, but it's also important societally, that we understand what these algorithms are doing to our society, and that they include survey data because we actually do care about beliefs and offline behaviors, and survey data generally would be the best tool for doing that. And so we need this. We need something really big and a very large fixed cost that is a resource for many scholars, and I think I think that's incredibly important for us to do collectively as a community. And the other thing I'll note, and this is more generally around like this, 2020, the pandemic, that that there's so much that was small scale and ad hoc, right, in terms of research, and that's including like our own efforts. I think we had a large effort, but like we're talking about an effort that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, but really it's not clear to me why there wasn't there really should have been a much larger effort that was both, and there were somewhat larger. HHS had something, there was a Facebook supported project, that's a survey that was taking place at Carnegie Mellon, but there wasn't really, I think, a well-coordinated toolkit for data collection. And I think that generally we should be ready for a ready deployable, large-scale, expensive effort to collect data around large-scale societal events. And we didn't get bigger. This was about as big as we're going to get, but like it's not going to be the only thing that we have, obviously, over coming decades. That we should be able to rapidly deploy something that's a regular survey of many tens of thousands of people, that includes online data collection, that includes other emerging forms of data. And we saw, like I said, a lot of this in bespoke efforts, but I think that there really should have been larger, it should have been better coordinated, it should have been better integrated. So I think that really we have failed at making these societal and global scale investments that really the pandemic called for. I mean, there was a lot of work that's gone on, but I think that we didn't really do the larger scale, some of the larger scale efforts that we should have. So I'll end there, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks all the panelists. It was an amazing session. We learned a lot. We do have a few questions. Also, a reminder for everybody, you can tag us on Twitter, NSF_prepare for the questions, or post questions onto the YouTube channel. Also, this is an asynchronous workshop, so we hope to keep looking at the questions and the answers, and the discussion kind of continues even later. So please feel free to engage with those opportunities. For the panel part, I will start us off by a couple of questions which are generic, and I think all the panelists would have some input on that, and then we look at some of the individual questions. So the first question I have for all the three panelists is this, that we have heard today about some amazing work on misinformation. Some of it intersected very nicely with COVID or pandemics in general, and some of that was beyond. So what do you think are the similarities, and what do you think are the differences when we are trying to tackle, let's say, pandemic-related misinformation as opposed to political misinformation or misinformation in a generic sense? So would somebody like to lead us?
So I can speak a little bit to that. Given that we've done elections around the world and the pandemic too, what we see differently in the elections is that we see a lot more misinformation that's of the form, let me trash someone's reputation, than we do during the pandemic. And we see a lot more stuff that is coming from and easily identifiable to various political parties or to outside sources that want a particular political outcome. In contrast, in the pandemic, you're getting more things that are not just targeted at specific subgroups, because you also see that in elections, but they're targeted at those groups, not to take their voice out of the election, but to do things like cause physical harm. And there's also misinformation that's spread in specific groups that are related to their underlying culture or their underlying the country they live in. So we see people, for example, spreading misinformation about fake cures and various fake kind of approaches to prevent fake preventions that are consistent with homeopathic medicine in that country. Okay, and that's very different. You wouldn't get that during an election. The other thing you see is that you see much more use of the pandemic as an international weapon. As you know, so it's weaponized for information warfare between countries and by non-state actors for that. And that's different than what you would see during an election.
Thank you so much, Kathleen.
I guess I'd chime in on that if that's okay, Vivek. I think something that we've seen in the last year, both with the election and with COVID, is that the misinformation and disinformation has been targeted in a specific way to disrupt our trust in institutions. And of course, like on one hand, like if you have a conspiracy theory, it's always a conspiracy of someone, which is usually some bigger institution. But they've been profoundly successful in reducing the trust that people have in government institutions, which traditionally had been very well respected on both sides. And I think that has had a really dramatic effect on society, and one that's really worrying in a way that conspiracy theories about the Kennedy assassination or the moon landing, or even like the Comet Pizza pedophilia conspiracy theory, which was kind of a QAnon precursor, we didn't see that same sort of broad attack on institutions in a way. So I think that's something that's concerning from the last year.
The one thing I would add, and again, I focused on the US, is that a lot of the COVID stuff did end up getting sucked into being political discourse, right? I mean, it's interesting because there's a different structure because COVID has this sort of scientific element, and I think that that science is viewed as a different realm of truth, potential truth value than politics. But we did see sort of this inexorable force pulling COVID into that political discourse, and in some ways it was almost inevitable because it loomed so large in the political moment, right? I mean, it's unfortunate that that the pandemic occurred in 2020, which was already going to be a funky year, and it just made that national force all the greater that the discourse, which was inevitably going to be politicized, would be politicized even more, because it was going to be what the election was about, right? I mean, the election was going to be about the pandemic. It was inevitable because that is like issue number one. And it's striking that when Twitter was trying to reduce the political misinformation around the election and on Jan 6, that it also sharply reduced the misinformation around COVID, and that's again fits as part of this story of like how it all ended up converging.
Well, this is like such an interesting thing with QAnon, right? That we start with this conspiracy theory that's baby eating, Satan worshiping, pedophilic cabal in Congress and the media, and Trump is going to save us from all of them with the storm. And it's like this weird kind of, I mean, very typical of these kind of like far right out there conspiracy theories that lurk in those scary places. And that, you know, that kind of, with all sorts of algorithmic stuff we can talk about, kind of makes its way kind of into the much more of the mainstream than it normally would. But then in 2020 enfolds all of the anti-vaccine, like questioning science, health conspiracy theory people who are not traditionally like far right-wing conspiracy theorists. It's a very different group. And QAnon managed to integrate all that conspiracy theory together in a way that, like David said, kind of merged the COVID conspiracy theory misinformation with the political misinformation and tied it to Trump. And I think a lot of that just all fed each other and brought a lot of people together in this misinformation space that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. It's such a strange example, but they were profoundly successful.
And it was very, very deliberately coordinated across the various platforms in doing this. And it wasn't all orchestrated by QAnon. There were other outside forces actually involved in creating the links among those groups.
The one thing I want to note is that well, I'll just highlight that our survey, if you go to the website, we have this trust tracker. So we have trust in different institutions. It's not that trust hasn't sort of fallen off the table, right? Like, I think that actually, you know, and you could break it down by party and so on, that, you know, actually people on both sides of the aisle largely do trust doctors and scientists and so on. But people on both sides of the aisle both distrust social media companies, ironically. So there is sort of like some degree of consensus. You do see, and you don't see, there's been a slight downward trend across all domains through the pandemic, but it's not been dramatic with a few exceptions. Like, I think there's been, Fauci's an interesting subject who has, on the right, sort of had a very steady and substantial reduction in trust through the pandemic, whereas on the left and among independents, it's been pretty steady. But you know, we have to be there. It's interesting to reflect on what has changed versus, like, there's always been a certain, I think, as a Richard Hofstadter put it, a paranoid style in U.S. politics. So.
Yes, thank you so much for these amazing, insightful comments. Another comment, or I guess a provocation or a starting point for us, is the role or the connections between social sciences and the computational sciences. It was really amazing to see in all three presentations, there was some kind of an intersection. We talked about things like trust and narcissism and, well, the computational tools to do the network analysis and so on. So what areas do you think are like the right intersection points? Where are the opportunities for the social scientists to learn more about the computational side of things and vice versa? Do you have some thoughts on that? And again, open to all three panelists.
So this is clearly an area that requires both, but that requires them both working together. I mean, one of the things that we've seen happening over and over again is that, you know, computer scientists get there and say, I'm going to solve hate speech, or I'm going to solve fake news. And they go in and they do something that's completely irrelevant and not usable, okay, and doesn't even attach to the main problem. And by the same token, you have social science, some people who don't know how to write computer code, but have a social science background, say, I'm going to invent a new tool, and they don't know how to make it actually scale up. So some of the advantages are getting them paired together, but you need people paired together over a long period of time, because you really need to read each other's journals, speak each other's language, you know, and work well, you know, play nice with each other. And some of the opportunities for people to want to get started in the space are to go to the computational social science conferences, to go to places like SBEG and IC2S2 and so on, where they can bring together these. The other thing is social networks as a field has actually been very instrumental in being a link stone that is both understandable from a social science perspective and from a computer science perspective, and has been, you know, one of those kind of nice segues linking the two together, which has been great. And the third thing is that there's a bunch of us now who actually run training sessions and so on how to link both kinds of ideas together that you can go to.
And I 100% agree with everything Kathleen just said. I think both on the collaboration and the points where we've seen productive intersections between computer science and social science, but it really does require this effort of conversation and fusion. I think that, it's particular, if I were to point methodologically to one place where I think there's potentially a lot of power, it's in linking survey data to online data. I think, surveys have been, incredibly powerful. They have their limitations, but they're an incredibly powerful tool that has been refined in the social sciences over the last, 80 years, really. But they have their limitations in terms of understanding really granular behaviors, right? So I think that that they're really not very good. They're pretty lousy, actually, at capturing what people are doing online in any kind of granular way. But that's, of course, we have the data. We can observe what people are doing, but being able to link survey data and online behavioral data, for example, is a place which really requires both social scientific and computational thinking, and so that would be, if I was just zooming in on like one place where I think there would be healthy investments. I would highlight that. I would also highlight to any more junior people who are listening, the summer institutes in computational social science, which I think have been an enormous success at sort of pulling people in to computational social science really around the world. It's become a global phenomenon. So
I think I would just add quickly, I mean, YouTube basically covered all the big stuff. I would just add that I think it's important when you're doing computational social science, which is the thing I do, is to be really clear about what the outcome is that you're trying to achieve. Like, is it a computational one or a social science one? Like, as somebody who builds models that have been really useful, I mean, the work that we've done on predicting personality, for example, for better or for worse, has made its way into a ton of applications, good and bad, and it has been a powerful tool. It gives you no insight. It gives you an answer to like, what are the personality traits of this person, but it doesn't give you any insight into why. It just tells you the scores that you can use. And as a computer scientist, that's all we want. And it's great and it's useful in applications. We're not trying to get a social science answer out of that. And on the other side, if you're trying to get a social science insight, you really don't need to be producing a computer science insight. And I think a lot of times we try to do both. Like, I'm going to build a model, and then also I'm going to like answer this really difficult social science question. And it's really hard to do both of those. But if you're clear about which one you want, if you want a computational answer, you still have to work with those social scientists, but know that what you're coming out with is a model on the other end. Or if you're trying to answer a social science question with some computational tools, you want a computer scientist in there who knows how to interpret those models, how to build a proper training set, how to get your results, but that you may not produce anything interesting computationally from that model. It's just going to be something that feeds the social science. So having that in mind, I think is an important thing. And it's something that I see a lot of people overlooking. And I know I did when I was more junior in this space, that I try to kind of put it all together, and that's problematic.
Thank you so much. The next question is, originally it was intended for Jennifer, but I think the other two panelists would also have some thoughts on that. It is this of traits versus states, and certain traits have been shown to be associated with misinformation, but well, in different domains and subdomains, there's always this debate that whether it's a function of somebody's trait, something long-term like personality, or the state, or rather the situation the person is currently in. For instance, actually, I'm remembering some work by Bernstein and colleagues on anybody can be a troll. So it's like they try to, well, at least in their work, show that it's not so much about immutable descriptors or certain characteristics. It's much more dynamic and it varies over time. So I just wanted to see if there were some thoughts on the state versus the trait argument as it pertains to misinformation, who spreads it, who consumes it, and things like that.
I mean, that's a great question. I certainly tend to be more interested in the traits element of this. And for me, I think that may actually come down to the data that we have access to, right? For me, it's like much easier to be like, all right, here's a history of social media interaction behavior from this person. How do I put that all together and predict this? But for sure, my entire career, a comment I've gotten is like, well, what if, how does this change over time? How do you deal with that? And it's like, I don't, but certainly it does. And for interventions, I think the states element is really important. That, detecting when have I entered a state where I'm going to start doing problematic things, or where I may be susceptible to a particular type of intervention. For me, at least, they're kind of separate questions in terms of the computational approach that you take to them. But that's really specific to my work. I think you're right. Like David and Kathleen probably have some, look at this in a different way and may have some other insights.
David, yeah.
The only thing I would note, and I agree, I think everything Jennifer said is right, and the one thing I would add in terms of thinking about misinformation is, in some sense, the objective or the thing we should care about is the trust people have in the system, right? So like we can focus on the trees, but in some sense, the forest is sort of levels of trust. And I'll just give sort of one little factoid out of our survey, which we have to write up somewhere, which is basically, if we're looking at something like, vaccine intentions for COVID, it was almost entirely captured by whether someone had gotten the flu vaccine. So it's problematic to attribute vaccine intentions for COVID as sort of being around particular pieces of misinformation, but that there's something more deep and structural going on. In part, may be about individuals' particular predispositions to trust the system. I think that's a large part of it. And others may be where people are situated in the information ecosystem, which is not supplying them with high quality information with respect to health. But like I said, it is remarkable that with all the stuff that we might discuss in terms of the particular crazy stuff going on, or around vaccines, around COVID vaccine in particular, that it's really something that causally it was antecedent to all of this stuff, which is like, did you get the flu vaccine? And that pretty much almost perfectly could predict whether you could get the COVID vaccine. So there is, which gets at the sort of the trait and state, is sort of like, well, really, in some sense, there are traits here that are partially malleable, but they're not really states, and that's ultimately what we care about, sort of this, in part, this epistemic trust, and where you are, structurally situated within the information ecosystem.
Yeah, I would just caution against always about talking about just what are the major trends, because it's also the case that people with totally different traits were spreading misinformation. They did it just for fun. It's also the case that lots of groups were bought to actually spread certain types of misinformation. That there were marketing firms that were hired to spread certain types of misinformation. So it's important to keep in mind that there's the big trend, but then there's lots of other things going on, and that we can't just look at the big trends. So just minor reminder, Vivek.
Okay, thank you everyone on that. The next question is also actually not directed to somebody, but it kind of connects our discussion yesterday. In some of the sessions, we spent a lot of time discussing othering, and like everybody is trying to blame everybody other than themselves, that's the reason for the spread of the pandemic or all the bad things happening. So were there some interconnections of that with misinformation, some exemplars or things that you would like to highlight?
I mean, I think the entirety of what I talked about is sort of that phenomenon, right? That we have our group in groups and out groups, right? the group we identify with and the ones that don't, regardless of if there's connective narcissism at play. We all identify as parts of different groups, whatever they are. That can escalate into a problematic space or not. But it gets cast from both sides. I think the question is, how factually is it cast, right? Like, I certainly have been like, I spent my pandemic in Florida, which was an interesting place to do it. And, had plenty of things to say about those people that made me not leave my house, from November until I got vaccinated in March. But I think we're pretty factual that there were a lot of people running around with masks and going to bars where I lived, and I didn't want to go. The conspiracy side of that is, well, it was this lab that engineered it, and people are lying about how deadly this is, and all of the stuff that David and Kathleen talked about in depth. So there's, I guess my point is that we all certainly blame other groups, but there is like a factual element to where that blame lies, and that's important. And I think that's what a lot of us are focused on detecting, right? That there is this notion that a lot of people will blame the other side, but how do you detect the people who are doing it accurately versus not?
So thinking about all the terabytes of data that we have, I would say maybe a third of it have a kind of an othering tone to the discussion and so on. A lot of the discussion, though, that's going on in social media was also about just restating facts or asking, what can I do? Or, saying what they themselves have been doing, or what their family or what their relations are doing. So there's a lot of additional information between that. So it's not just, and in both sides of that, the othering part and the non-othering part, there is misinformation being spread on both parts. So.
I don't think I can add any value over what Jennifer and Kathleen have just said, but I think it's on the to-do list to look at the othering issues more, because I agree it's totally important and it's definitely there. But we haven't, I don't have rigorous insights to share on that, but it's a great question.
Sure, thank you. So the next question, which is also for everyone, it's are there clear ways for social media companies to help in reducing misinformation? What kind of regulation will help, or what else could be done in this space?
So we saw that when Twitter would put up things and saying, or Facebook, when they would say things like, this is fake news, it just often caused it to be spread more. We also saw that if something was removed by one platform, it would just simply reappear. If they suspend certain actors who are spreading it, they tend to go darker and it becomes harder to find them, but they do not become less effective. So part of the issue here is that collaboration among them and a consistent uniform strategy across platforms would have more effect than anyone acting on their own, because we have an ecosystem of these, they're also interconnected. The second thing is that it's hard for them to do things that stop the spread of disinformation that don't also stop the spread of critically good and important information, right? Because the exact same kind of influence strategies that are used to promote disinformation are used to promote cancer-saving drugs, or cancer-saving approaches, or to promote people to go to places of safety during natural disasters. So you have to be very careful about that. And this is not a thing also that is, the big platforms have to solve it, because this is a global issue, and what counts as disinformation varies from country to country. And this is something we need to get the academicians, the platforms, the governments together to create kind of an overboard to decide, what do we as communities need to do This is not just a platform, solve it all for me.
You know, I think the one thing I'd say is, in a sense, we are vastly unequal to the task to answer that question. I think, I mean, I agree with everything Kathleen said, but I also think that the platforms just have so much resources, and when we think about government and civil society, we don't really have that capacity to see what's going on in the internet. And even the platforms don't necessarily have, when you talk to folks in the platforms about this question, they're very oriented towards their platform. So it doesn't appear to be their fault. But this does miss that systemic element that Kathleen was just talking about, that this is really a multi-platform issue and nobody's really looking out for the system of systems. And we can think about like Facebook, the Facebooks and the Googles, and they are super important, but then you can look at, you know, other things that I mean, everything's a platform. Like, you know, if like one example of a misinformation campaign that we've looked at is something around apricot seeds as a cure for cancer. They don't cure cancer, by the way, just to be clear. But there's a whole like campaign to make you think that apricot seeds will cure cancer. And that's in part, there's a website, which you may get to through Google. There's Facebook pages, but then there's also reviews of apricot seeds as a product, because there's a monetary incentive here. And so what you'll see if you go to Amazon, look at apricot seeds, is that gets rated 4.8. And there's testimonial after testimonial of how apricot seeds cured someone's stage 4 cancer. Now, that is a misinformation campaign, and Amazon has done nothing. Not only have they done nothing about it, but if I now actually, ironically, just get deluged with emails from Amazon promoting apricot seeds, because I've looked at the products, right? And they're like, oh, Lazer is interested in apricot seeds, so we're going to try selling it to him. When I've gone to Google to look at this, there's Amazon advertising apricot seeds cancer, right? Like that's the keywords that they're zooming in on. It's not because there's anyone at Amazon who's really, you know, trying to make money off of this specific thing. It's just like, well, you know, the algorithm finds that we get more sales of this product if you zoom in on these keywords, even if what it's really doing is selling not only a product that isn't going to cure the cancer, but actually can be fatal if consumed too much, because there's cyanide in apricot seeds. If you go to WebMD, which is a very credible source of information, of health information, there are product reviews in WebMD. And guess what? You go to apricot seeds, it gets a 4.7 rating, because WebMD is a platform that doesn't police the content, the health information that it crowdsources. And so all of this is to say that that you know, there is a coordinated campaign around apricot seeds, like of all things, right? Like this is just a very specific thing, but it is a multi-platform campaign, and it's interconnected in various ways, where Amazon is manipulating Google and so on to sell products, and then Google has excerpts from WebMD or whatever, or you know, suggests YouTube's videos that will tell you all about the wonders of apricot seeds. So this again gets at this very complexity of the issue, and the fact that we don't have the tools. And this goes back to what I said in my presentation. We just don't have the tools to even, you know, think about regulation well. I mean, I think that we need to think about regulation, because there are all these. It's a classic public goods issue. Like, but we are so unequal to the task relative to the information that's needed to regulate well.
So I guess the thing I would add to that, I agree with everything Kathleen and David have said. And I would add that while solving the whole problem is incredibly difficult for all the ways they listed and many more, there are steps that the platforms generally aren't taking that they should, that would have a big impact. And David shared this data, right? You deplatform Trump, and then there's kind of small group talking about specific things around him, you see this dramatic drop in the amount of misinformation on the platform because you deplatform Trump. And we absolutely could do very straightforward things like that. We know that there are a small number of people spreading this misinformation, originating it, right? We know that the platforms are very good at blocking accounts that spring up after that from the same people. And that's a thing they could be doing. There are lists out there. There are data sources that platforms and academics compile on sources of misinformation, right? I mean, I have published data sets on like, here's a bunch of fake news sites, here's a bunch of satire sites, not the same thing. The platforms know all of those and many more. You could make it so if I want to post a link to known website that violates the platform's terms for the misinformation that's there, sure, I can go ahead and post it, but it's not a clickable link. You don't get a preview. We just take away all the interface elements. So I can put HTTP whatever, and you see the URL and you don't see anything else, and it's hard to click and you can't share it. There's really straightforward steps that I think would make a dramatic impact in the volume of misinformation that's shared, in the spread of the misinformation. It doesn't get to any of the complex issues that David and Kathleen rightfully raised. Those are important. But I think if we take the easiest possible steps in line with the platforms enforcing their own terms, that it would have a huge impact on this. And the platforms have been unwilling to do that for a variety of reasons. They're politically afraid of it. They're afraid of running foul of the editorial rules. That's where I think we do need regulation, right? To step in and say, we're going to force you to enforce your own terms, or else you suffer the consequences that come from not doing that. But yeah, I mean, while it is a complex problem, I think there's simple solutions that would have big impacts that we haven't really seen happening, except for the deplatforming of Trump, which, if anything, demonstrates that those simple steps could be really effective.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all the insightful thoughts and comments. And actually, we are almost coming to the end of the session. So everybody, please join me in thanking all the speakers and the panelists. We've learned a lot to think about. I would just like to thank everyone and then pass it to Anil and Madhav if they had some last thoughts on the session or some other announcements.
Yeah, I'd like to second Vivek. Thanks so much, Kathleen, Jennifer, and David, for the wonderful talks and the great discussion. And like Vivek mentioned earlier, there's questions still coming. So so you can interact with it and respond on that YouTube channel as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to second what Anil and Vivek said. Absolutely brilliant session. I think the topic that really needs to be discussed for many, many more workshops, I think. And you folks had a very, very interesting view. Thank you very much for joining us. And hopefully you folks can continue to participate in the asynchronous part. As Vivek has said, I think we need to have a healthy and robust debate. And I can't think of better folks to lead the discussion because the time is limited. I don't think we can do it all here. But if we can continue this, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much.